Institute of North America. And there, there are several different definitions of integrated pest management. But basically what they say is, it's an approach to solving pest problems by applying your knowledge about pests to prevent them from damaging crops, harming animals, infesting buildings, or otherwise interfering with our livelihood or enjoyment of life. IPM means responding to pest problems with the most effective, least risk option. Okay. So under integrated pest management, actions are taken to control pests only when their numbers are likely to exceed acceptable levels, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And then any action taken is designed to target the troublesome pest and limit the impact on other organisms in the environment. One important key thing to mention with this is that third box over. It says applying pesticides to crops, animals, buildings, or landscapes on a routine basis, regardless of need, is not considered an integrated pest management program, basically. Applications of pesticides are always the last resort in an IPM program. So to me, the 4 basic steps to an integrated pest management program is, the first one is going to be to observe and to determine if you actually have a weed problem that needs to be controlled. The second one's going to be identify the weeds that you are trying to get rid of. The third one is going to be controlling those weeds. Obviously, I'm going to talk a little bit about using multiple, an integrated approach to that to try to control those weeds, and then observe the results and adjust if you need to. So when observing, if you have a weed problem, the simple definition of a weed is going to be considered a plant out of place. So whether this is in your pasture, your flower beds, lawn, gardens, anything like that, that plant, if that plant is not supposed to be there, then technically we do call it a weed. But one of the key things with an integrated pest management system is to determine your tolerance for that weed and determine at what level you need to try to control those weeds in that area. So an example, a pasture example of this would be, a lot of the research that's out there is going to tell you about 30% weed cover is going to be what you see to economically justify a weed control measure. Depending on, if you have a pasture, depending on the stocking rates and that kind of stuff, some people can tolerate more weeds, some people can't tolerate quite as much. It just depends on the situation. One important note is 30% weed cover is quite a bit, though, for sure. Again, that's just kind of a rule of thumb value with that. So again, just kind of going through with the kind of a pasture scenario. In some cases, weeds can be even beneficial. If we have crabgrass in a Bermuda grass pasture, even though that's considered a plant out of place, that could actually be beneficial in providing good forage and good forage quality to a pasture. So again, it all kind of just depends on what you consider a weed and what you're able to tolerate. But basically, the concept of controlling those weeds is, if you remove those weeds, you give the favorable grasses an opportunity to have a competitive advantage, to compete for the light, the moisture, and the fertility as well. The general rule of thumb is you're going to see about 1 pound of weeds per 1 pound of grass. So if you control a pound of weeds, you could kind of expect to gain a pound, or you lose basically a pound of grass for every pound of weeds. So in general, if you eliminate 100 pounds of weeds per acre, depending on the situation, you could potentially get an additional 100 pounds of grass production in that pasture. Looking at from an economic standpoint, if you consider an average unfertilized pasture producing 10,000 or 2,000 pounds of dry matter per acre, if 30% of that is weeds, then you're actually only going to get about 1,400 pounds of usable forage out there in your pasture, right? If you apply a herbicide treatment that controls 90% of those weeds, you can gain an additional, in this example, 570 pounds of forage. If you have a treatment that costs $12 per acre, then that additional forage that you're getting is costing you about $42 a ton. Okay, so just kind of working through that, determining if it's economically feasible to control those weeds can kind of help with an integrated pest management system. Make sure you're not controlling an unnecessary amount, basically. Obviously, in other settings like lawns and flower beds, weeds may need to be controlled simply due to aesthetic purposes, and so that's a little bit different situation. Again, it just depends on what you're willing to tolerate. So the second step of the integrated pest management system is going to be identifying the pests or the weeds that are bothering you. The reason why we want to make sure that we properly identify them is to so we have a good understanding of their biology, basically their life cycle, their growth patterns, all that kind of stuff can kind of affect how we can manipulate, when we spray herbicides, if we have to use herbicides, and just making sure that we time things appropriately to be able to get a good efficacy of the weed control method that we plan to use. Just real quickly, I'm going to go over, weed classification. So based on the life cycle, you have your animals or your annuals, sorry. And that's where it's going to produce seed. You go from seed to seed in one season. Your biennials are going to do seed to rosette to seed in 1 to 2 years. And then your perennials are going to be the ones that live from year to year. These are the ones that are going to have, rhizomes and tubers and carbohydrate stores that are underneath the ground. And so those can be a little bit more challenging to control because they have that storage system underneath. So they can kind of come back year to year. Like I said, annuals complete their life cycle in less than 1 year. So summer annuals, they're going to germinate in the spring, grow through the summer, and then mature and then die in the fall. Winter annuals are going to germinate in the fall and winter time, mature, and then die in the springtime. Typical characteristics of annual weeds, you're going to see a little bit shallower taproot. Again, like I said, establishing from seed each year. And then that seedling stage is going to be a critical control stage for those annual weeds. Examples of annual weeds: pigweed, ragweed, henbit, foxtail, that kind of stuff. When it comes to controlling annual weeds, some of those challenges that we can see specifically with annuals is there can be a pretty long germination window from seed. So if you put down a post-emergent after one round, after some of the seeds germinated, a few weeks later you can actually see another round of germination that you kind of skip. So it's kind of hard with that long germination window. So again, it may take multiple control efforts. And annual weeds tend to produce a whole lot of seed really quickly as well. The advantages to having annual weeds is if you prevent it from going to seed, you can actually decrease the number of seeds in that seed bank and help suppress that annual weed from year to year. Perennial weeds, obviously the year 1 is going to be the best time to control those. When they're little bitty seedlings, that's going to be the easiest time to target them. After year 1, like I said, they've got that reproductive material. They've got those carbohydrate stores under the ground, so it's a little bit more difficult. You may need to use more of a multi-year approach for that. Biennials, like I said, live for more than 1, but typically not over 2 years. Year 1, obviously, that's going to be the best time to try to control them when they're seedlings. And then year 2 may be a little bit more difficult as well. Examples are poison hemlock and Canada thistle. So when it comes to identifying weeds, there are several different resources out there that can kind of help you identify them. I know I use the Weeds of Southern Turf Grasses quite a bit. That's actually a really good one for pastures as well. There's also an app called Picture This that I use quite frequently as well. It may not get you exactly what the weed is, but it can get you pretty close, and then you can kind of go from there. But it's been pretty good, pretty reliable as well. Also, contacting your local county extension educator will help as well. So looking at, when to spray these different types of weeds, winter annuals, you could potentially spray those November through March. Summer annuals, April through mid-July. Again, they've got that long germination window, so it may be a little bit more difficult. And then perennials is going to be a little bit more dependent on what their growth stage is. So the third step of the integrated pest management program basically is going to be controlling those weeds. Okay, so you've already determined you have a weed problem. You've already identified what your weeds are. So now it's going to be time to try to control them and use a multifaceted approach with that. A lot of times you'll hear people saying using many tools in the toolbox. So to help reduce and manage a pest problem, we can use different tools corresponding to using a combination of biological, chemical, cultural, and mechanical methods to try to control those weeds that we see. And by using multiple methods, we can also combat herbicide resistance issues that we have seen in several different plant species. Kind of an analogy to this would be trying to use a screwdriver and only a screwdriver to fix your car's transmission. It's not a multifaceted approach. It might be a little bit more difficult to control. So looking at some of these integrated pest management strategies. So like I said on the previous slide, biological control is one option. An example of this would be the musk thistle rosette weevil. I know there's been some work done with a specific weevil that actually targets musk thistles. So releasing them into a field with significant amount of musk thistle can kind of help reduce that population. I'm not sure if I would consider it biological, but applying fertilizer to pastures can also help, because it can kind of help with that plant, that the desirable species to get a competitive advantage over undesirable weeds. Chemical control, obviously that's going to be more of your herbicides that you would use. Physical and mechanical, some examples would be hand weeding or mowing, things like that. And then cultural would be like cleaning machinery, cleaning your hay equipment. If you can see in this picture over here on the right, you see all those stickers. If you drive through a field, you're just introducing all of those seeds to a field. So make sure you clean everything. If you can purchase clean bales of hay that's not too weedy or anything like that, that can really help decrease the number of weeds that are introduced into your field. Okay. Oops. Yeah, okay. So an example of using several tools in the toolbox in a pasture scenario would include grazing, so mechanical control there. You can control a lot of smaller, young, annual type weeds by grazing them, adding a little bit more grazing pressure, maybe do some rotational grazing. While those weeds are still palatable, you can actually force those livestock to eat them and then decrease the chance for them to go to seed and cause a weed infestation later on. Fertility is another one, like I said, that can give those desirable species a competitive advantage. An example of this would be broom sedge. Typically, broom sedge is something that can be controlled fairly easily with increasing fertility in Bermuda grass pastures. So again, using that rather than jumping straight to a herbicide option might actually be a better option for you. Fire is another potential option. You know, if you have a pasture, you can do some spring burning just after the weeds emerge to help control some annual species as well. Herbicides, again, ideally what you're going to want to do with herbicides is you're going to want to go for obviously you're going to want to go for the cheaper option of a herbicide. So making sure that you've got the right weed, or you've got the right identification of the weed, and making sure that you identify it early on so it's not too mature can help you kind of get as cheap of an option of a herbicide as possible. And then, like I said, mowing as well. Mowing those mature weeds can kind of help prevent it from going to seed. It can kind of keep it a little bit more vegetative, a little bit easier for livestock to eat as well, to try to prevent those weeds from infesting. A lot of times I get questions about, you know, should I spray or should I mow? So I just kind of wanted to throw this in here real quick. If you were to decide to mow your pastures and mow down all the weeds that are out there, you are decreasing selectivity. So you're going to put everything on that same playing field because you're going to all mow it all the same. A lot of times what you're going to see is this is going to be more effective on annuals than perennials, because again, those perennials have those underground carbohydrate stores. It's going to be a lot easier for them to recover after being mowed. You're going to see a little bit greater effect on broadleaf weeds than in grasses. And if you time it correctly, you can prevent weed seed production, okay? If you wait until it's too late, and if you wait until those plants have already seeded out, the mowing process is just going to spread those seeds further into your pasture, and it's going to make a bigger problem than you had hoped for. There's a point on here that says consistency is key to effective weed control with mowing. So I wanted to give you kind of an example of that. This is just to show you that, you know, if you were to mow multiple times a year for 2 years, it's actually been shown that you can get 80 to 90% control of ironweed and goldenrod in a pasture. Again, so maybe using that option or as an alternative to using it as an expensive herbicide, or using this in addition to herbicides, can kind of help suppress the weeds that you're seeing and maybe help try to prevent resistance as well. So timing's not only important just for the mowing aspect of it, but also for herbicide application as well, okay? So most weeds can be treated with herbicides. They should be sprayed when they're small and actively growing, okay? So an example with this is using 2,4-D. You can actually control quite a few broadleaf weeds with that if they are smaller, okay? As those plants get bigger, you're probably going to have to use a little bit stronger herbicide, a little bit more expensive herbicide to try to control those plants. So again, if you look in your fields and you see it small, it's going to be a lot easier to control it and a lot cheaper to control it, okay? This is just to reiterate that timing is important. So this is, you know, you can see some young bitter sneezeweed plants in this picture. If you're driving across your field in a truck or something like that, this may look like grass to you. You know, it may not be something that you think is a significant problem right away, but it's actually those young plants that can be an issue. So in this picture here, you can see that the application, so this picture was taken August 19th. The left side is a May 3rd application of 2,4-D, and then the right side is going to be a June 17th application of 2,4-D. So just over, you know, about a month and a half, just under a month and a half or so time difference can make all the difference in the world, okay? So just keep that in mind going forward. So now that I talked a little bit about integrated pest management kind of by itself, I do want to talk a little bit about pest or herbicide resistance. And so again, making sure you use a multiple tools in the toolbox approach can kind of help diminish or to try to help alleviate the potential for herbicide resistance in certain plants. Okay. So the general definition of herbicide resistance is it's the inherited ability to survive and reproduce following exposure to a dose of herbicide that would be normally lethal to the wild type. Okay. So basically, in other words, what once worked is no longer effective on those plants. Okay. Resistant weed biotypes are a consequence of basic evolutionary processes, and I've got a little example I'll show you in a minute. But basically, individuals within a species that are best adapted to a particular practice are going to be selected for, and it will increase in population. Okay, so basically, only the fittest will survive. Some weed traits that favor resistance is going to be an annual growth habit. Again, a lot of those annual plants are going to see, you're going to see a lot of high seed production. They're going to produce a whole lot of seed. If you have a high percentage of viable seeds each year, and then if you have multiple, if those plants seed out multiple times a year, so multiple reproductive generations per year as well. So kind of talking about that high seed production, this is just to kind of put it in perspective to how much seed plants can produce per year. Lamb's quarters, for example, can produce over 50,000 seeds per year. Red root pigweed can produce 10 to 500,000 seeds per year. Cheatgrass, 25,000 seeds per year. Common groundsel can produce over 20,000 seeds per year. So that's quite a few seeds, all of which are going to have slightly different, genetic makeup of each of those different seeds. So the potential for there to be some sort of genetic mutation for that plant to become resistant to a herbicide is pretty high the more seeds that they produce. So here's a little bit of just a visual example to show you how that works. So say you have a pasture that you are going to spray, and you've got a whole bunch of weeds, but one of those plants is going to be a little bit more resistant to the herbicide that you've applied. Okay. That one plant is going to be able to mature because it was not affected devastatingly by that herbicide. It's going to be able to mature, and it's going to produce, say, 50,000 seeds. Okay. Of those 50,000 seeds, you may have one, you may have none, or you may have 2 or 3 plants that genetic mutation or something like that has actually passed along to some other plants. And so then you end up with a few more plants that actually have that mutation for herbicide resistance. Okay. So say you spray that, and it's the same sort of thing. Those couple more plants that you have out there are going to mature. They're going to reproduce seed, and you're just reinforcing over time and time again the likelihood of the resistance of that plant with that herbicide. You're just reinforcing that and reintroducing that into the pasture, making it more and more difficult over time to try to control those weeds. Cross resistance. So there's two main different types of resistance. You have cross resistance. So that's going to be resistant to multiple herbicides within a single mode of action. So for example, ALS resistance in ryegrass. And you've got several different herbicides that have that mode of action that ryegrass is going to be resistant to. Multiple resistance, on the other hand, is going to be resistant to multiple herbicide modes of action. So for example, pigweed being resistant to triazine and also the ALS herbicides. A lot of times what you see here is you'll have a herbicide that worked, say you have triazine that you've used for a long time. Then you started seeing a resistant pigweed population. So you decide to switch your herbicide to a ALS herbicide. Then you start using that for an extended period of time, which can kind of cause, again, that resistance to multiple herbicide modes of action. Looking at things that could promote resistance, relying on a single herbicide or mode of action, using highly effective herbicides, species that are highly susceptible to resistance. So again, those annual species and things like that. Lack of herbicide rotations, lack of crop rotations. So if you plant the same crops every year, you use the same herbicides every year, you're eventually probably you could potentially see some herbicide resistance in that situation. In addition to that, application can also, the way you apply it can actually promote herbicide resistance as well. So making sure you've got the correct application rate, and making sure that everything's calibrated appropriately, and also making sure that you time it appropriately, can kind of help be as effective as possible to try to kill out those plants. This slide is just an example to show the increase in glyphosate resistant weeds worldwide. So, back with the introduction of glyphosate, that was a pretty life-changing herbicide back in the day. And so a lot of times for years and years and years and time again, people have gone back to using glyphosate, to using Roundup to kill out a lot of the weeds that they were coming across. And so after years and years and years of doing that, you can see on this graph here, getting into 2010 through 2020, there's been a significant increase in the number of species of weeds that have shown resistance to glyphosate. So again, if we keep reiterating that, we keep using glyphosate over and over and over again, I imagine that there's just going to be a steady increase of resistance that we would see. This trend can be similar in herbicides if you have a multiple resistant situation. So if you use, say, glyphosate for years on end, and then you switch to something else and you use that for years on end, then you're in a situation where you've got those plants with multiple resistance, multiple herbicides that do not affect it. And so then that could be an issue as well. This map is just to kind of give you an idea that, for example, glyphosate resistance, that is definitely a real thing, and it's definitely something that people are battling. You can see in the graph, water hemp, horseweed, mare's tail. There is some resistance that has been observed in Oklahoma. So just, again, using integrated pest management, using multiple methods, trying to rely a little bit less on one herbicide, maybe switching up, changing up the different types of herbicides that you have to use to try to decrease the potential for resistance. So another thing I wanted to talk about is the importance of application on preventing herbicide resistance. I think I had this slide in here double. So basically, when it comes to managing herbicide resistance and that kind of stuff, make sure you educate yourself. Like I said before, make sure you're able to properly identify the weeds, so you use the appropriate herbicides or other pest management strategies to help control that specific type of weed. Again, using integrated pest management strategies, whether that be cultural, mechanical, biological, chemical, using a multi-step approach, multiple steps in the toolbox to try to mitigate or to try to reduce the weed pressure. Make sure you select the correct herbicides and make sure that you apply them correctly and time it appropriately for those herbicides to be effective as well. Ways to try to help avoid or delay onset. Obviously, ideally, you would try to avoid herbicide resistance. But again, using multiple tools in your toolbox, understand the biology of your weeds, making sure you're timing it correctly, determining if you need a single year or multi-year approach for different types of weeds. Make sure you clean all of your equipment, avoid, bringing weeds into your property. Scout and monitor is another one too. Go out there, go out in your field, look and see when those plants are, an inch or so tall. They're going to be a lot more susceptible to the herbicides, and it's going to probably be quite a bit cheaper for you to do so as well. If you happen to have, or if you suspect that you have resistant herbicide resistant weeds, you would probably want to confirm this first. So maybe reaching out to someone who's a professional and in that area, maybe even reaching out to your county extension educator to try to help with that. A lot of times what you're going to see is it's going to take a while it says getting resistant weeds susceptible again, but basically it's just going to take several generations of using alternative herbicides or alternative pest management strategies to try to outcome or to what's the word? Basically that mutation to try to change that back to where you could potentially reintroduce that herbicide again. Introducing more resistant crops or traits. There are some different species of plants that have a trait built in them so you can actually utilize different types of herbicide modes of actions without damaging or harming the desirable species. Also increasing crop competitiveness, so making sure your fertility is right. For example, in the pasture, get your fertility right with your Bermuda grass. Don't overgraze it. And that kind of stuff that can actually be incredibly competitive against those resistant weeds. And it's not something that you have to rely on herbicides, so you can actually outcompete those weeds. They die back, and then it'll decrease your weed pressure.